The bullet that took Vincent Northfield's voice didn't kill him, but some days he wished it had. San Pedro, California, in the summer of 1878 was a town clinging to the edge of the Pacific, where the salt air mixed with the dust of cattle drives, and the shouts of sailors mingled with the cries of cowboys. Vincent had arrived 3 years ago with nothing but his horse, his gun, and a throat that no longer worked the way it should. The scar across his neck was hidden beneath bandanas he wore regardless of the heat, and the silence that followed him was heavier than any saddle he'd ever carried. Once, he'd been known throughout Arizona territory for his voice, singing cattle to sleep on long drives, entertaining saloons with old Irish ballads his mother had taught him. Now, at 28, he worked the docks loading cargo, fixing fences, doing anything that required strong hands and no words. He lived in a boarding house on the edge of town run by a widow named Mrs. Pritchard, who never asked questions and seemed to appreciate his quiet nature. Most evenings, Vincent would sit on the porch watching the sun sink into the Pacific, his fingers occasionally moving to his throat, remembering what it felt like to let sound flow freely. The other boarders had long since stopped trying to draw him into conversation. He would nod, shake his head, and occasionally write brief notes when absolutely necessary, but mostly he existed in a world of gesture and silence. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed, though Vincent had no way of knowing it as he walked toward the general store for tobacco. The streets were busy with the usual chaos of a port town, wagons rattling past, children darting between buildings, and somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn bellowing its arrival. He was focused on avoiding a mud puddle when he heard it, a sound so pure and unexpected that it stopped him mid-step. Someone was humming. It wasn't unusual for people to hum, of course, but this was different. The tune was an old one, older than memory, something that reached back into the parts of Vincent that he tried to bury along with his voice. His mother had sung it while kneading bread, his father had whistled it while mending fences, and Vincent himself had made it his own on countless starlit nights with nothing but cattle and sky for an audience. The melody was Irish, brought across an ocean by people searching for something better, and it carried with it all the longing and hope of those who'd left everything behind. Vincent turned, searching for the source, and found her standing in front of the dressmaker's shop, a bolt of blue fabric in her arms and her face tilted slightly upward as if the tune was being drawn from her by the morning sun itself. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark hair pinned back in a practical style, and a dress that marked her as working class but respectable. Her features were delicate, but her hands looked strong, the hands of someone who knew real work. But it was the humming that held him captive, the way she carried the melody with small variations that suggested she knew it as intimately as he did, without thinking, without even realizing what he was doing until the sound was already emerging. Vincent opened his mouth and joined her. His voice was not what it had been. It was rough, scarred, breaking on certain notes and catching on others like cloth on thorns. But it was there, actual sound emerging from a throat that had been silent for 3 years, and the shock of it nearly made him stop. The woman's eyes flew open and found his across the dusty street, her humming faltering for just a moment before continuing, a smile beginning to spread across her face that was part delight and part wonder. They finished the verse together, her humming and his broken singing creating something that shouldn't have been beautiful but somehow was. And when the last note faded into the noise of the street, Vincent stood frozen, his hand instinctively going to his throat. The pain was immediate and sharp, but beneath it was something else, something he'd thought dead and buried in an Arizona canyon alongside the outlaws who'd shot him. I haven't heard that song in years, the woman said, stepping down from the storefront's wooden walkway and crossing toward him. Her voice had a slight accent, maybe Irish or Scottish, softened by years but not erased. My grandmother used to sing it back in County Cork. How do you know it? Vincent opened his mouth and nothing came out. The moment had passed. The magic or madness or whatever had allowed those few notes had vanished, and he was left with his familiar silence and a throat that burned like he'd swallowed hot coals. He gestured helplessly, frustrated beyond words, which was precisely the problem. Understanding flickered across her face, followed by something that might have been sympathy but looked more like simple acceptance. You can't talk. He shook his head, then nodded, then made a gesture that tried to convey sometimes, maybe, it's complicated. She watched his hands with close attention, her head tilted slightly, and then nodded as if he'd spoken clearly. But you know the song, she said, and it wasn't a question. Someone you loved must have taught it to you. Vincent nodded, and before he could think better of it, he found himself miming a woman kneading bread. The gesture was simple but apparently clear enough because the woman's smile turned sad and knowing. Your mother, she said softly. Mine too. Well, my grandmother, but she raised me after my mother passed. She shifted the bolt of fabric to one arm and extended her hand. I'm Clara Daniels. I work at the Northern Star Saloon, but I'm not a working girl if that's what you're thinking. I keep the books and manage the inventory. The owner's my uncle and he's respectable, mostly. Vincent took her hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip, and struggled with how to introduce himself. Finally, he pulled a stub of pencil from his pocket, something he carried always out of necessity, and looked around for something to write on. Clara, understanding immediately, flipped over a paper wrapped around the fabric and offered it to him. His handwriting was rough from lack of practice with the pencil, but he managed. Vincent Northfield. Vincent, she repeated, and something about the way she said his name made it sound less like a label and more like a discovery. It's good to meet you, Vincent Northfield. That song, does it have words where you learned it? My grandmother only ever hummed it. She said the words were lost somewhere between Ireland and America, left behind like so much else. He nodded eagerly and gestured to his throat, then made a motion like opening a book, trying to convey that yes, there were words, but he couldn't share them now. The frustration must have shown on his face because Clara reached out and touched his arm briefly, a gesture of comfort that surprised them both. Maybe you could write them down sometime, she suggested. I'd like to know them, even if I can only read them silently. She glanced back at the dressmaker's shop, where a stern-faced woman was watching their exchange with obvious curiosity. I should go. Mrs. Henderson doesn't like to be kept waiting, and she's making me a new dress for Sundays. But Vincent, I'm at the Northern Star most evenings doing the books in the back office. If you wanted to stop by sometime, bring those words you can't say out loud, I'd be grateful. Before he could respond, she was gone, the blue fabric bright against her dark dress as she disappeared back into the shop. Vincent stood in the middle of the street, people flowing around him like water around a stone, his throat aching and his heart doing something complicated behind his ribs. He'd sung. For the first time in 3 years, he'd made music, and it had been because of her, because of a tune that connected them across years and oceans to people they'd both loved and lost. He didn't go to the Northern Star that evening. He told himself it was because he needed time to write out the lyrics properly, that his handwriting needed to be clearer, that he should copy them onto decent paper instead of whatever scraps he could find. But the truth, which he admitted to himself as he lay in his narrow boarding house bed that night, was that he was afraid. Afraid that the moment had been an aberration, a trick of memory and morning light. afraid that if he sought her out deliberately, the fragile connection would snap. Afraid, most of all, that he'd been alone so long he no longer knew how to be anything else. But the song stayed with him. He found himself humming it while working the docks the next day, the melody running through his head in Clara's voice and his mother's voice and his own ruined voice, all tangled together. The other workers noticed his distraction, how he'd pause mid-task with a distant expression, and one of them, a grizzled sailor named Pete, finally asked if he was feeling all right. Vincent nodded and made a vague gesture of reassurance, but Pete didn't look convinced. "You've got the look of a man who's seen a ghost or fallen in love," Pete observed, coiling rope with the ease of long practice. "In my experience, both can be equally dangerous, though at least love might kiss you before it drowns you." The comment made Vincent smile despite himself, and he returned to work with renewed focus. But Pete's words lingered. Was that what this was? Love was too strong a word for a single meeting, a shared song, but something had shifted inside him, some wall he'd carefully constructed beginning to show cracks. That evening he sat at the small desk in his room and began to write. His handwriting was poor, his spelling worse, but he worked through 3 pieces of paper before he had something that looked presentable. The words to the song were simple, telling of a girl who waited by the sea for her love to return from distant shores, watching the horizon until her hair turned white and her eyes grew dim, faithful until the end. It was a sad song, the kind the Irish seemed to specialize in, but there was beauty in the sadness, a recognition that some things were worth the waiting and the grief. Beneath the lyrics, he found himself writing more, trying to explain what the song meant to him, how his mother had sung it during the hard years after his father died, how he'd carried it west with him like a talisman. The words came haltingly, and he crossed out as much as he kept, but eventually he had something that felt true. He folded the paper carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, where it sat for 2 more days like a coal slowly burning toward his heart. On Friday evening, Vincent finally walked to the Northern Star Saloon. The building was one of the nicer establishments in San Pedro, 2 stories of whitewashed wood with real glass windows and a painted sign that creaked in the ocean breeze. Music spilled from inside. A piano played with more enthusiasm than skill, and through the windows he could see the usual crowd of sailors, cowboys, and local men seeking entertainment and escape. Vincent had been inside exactly once, shortly after arriving in San Pedro, and the noise had driven him out within minutes. But he pushed through the door now, his hand unconsciously checking that the folded paper was still in his pocket, and made his way through the crowd. A few men glanced at him with vague recognition, the quiet man from the docks, but most paid him no attention. The bartender, a large man with impressive mustaches, caught Vincent's eye and raised an eyebrow in question. Vincent made a writing motion and mouthed Clara's name, hoping the gesture would be understood. The bartender's expression shifted to something that might have been protective wariness, but he jerked his head toward a door at the back of the room. "Office is back there. You cause Miss Clara any trouble, you'll be swimming home." "Understood," Vincent nodded quickly, trying to convey harmless intentions through body language alone, and the bartender grunted acceptance. The door led to a narrow hallway that smelled of whiskey and tobacco, with stairs leading up to what were probably rooms for rent, and another door marked with a hand-painted sign reading office. Vincent knocked softly, his heart doing uncomfortable things. "Come in," Clara's voice called, and he opened the door to find her sitting at a desk covered in ledgers and papers, an oil lamp casting warm light across her face. She looked up, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to genuine pleasure when she recognized him. "Vincent, you came." He stepped inside, suddenly aware of how small the office was, how close they'd be in this space. Clara set down her pen and stood, smoothing her skirt in a gesture that seemed more nervous habit than necessity. She was wearing a different dress than when he'd seen her before, this one a deep green that brought out flecks of color in her hazel eyes. "I wasn't sure you would," she admitted. "After you disappeared the other day, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, or that you thought me too forward, approaching a stranger on the street like that." She laughed softly. "My uncle says I'm too bold for my own good, that I should be more reserved like proper ladies are supposed to be." Vincent shook his head firmly and reached for the paper in his pocket. His hands were trembling slightly as he unfolded it and offered it to her, feeling more exposed than if he'd stripped naked in the street. Clara took the paper carefully, as if it were something precious, and moved closer to the lamp to read. He watched her face as she read, seeing her lips move slightly with the words, her expression shifting from interest to something deeper. When she finished the lyrics, she continued to the personal note he'd added, and her eyes grew bright with what might have been tears. She looked up at him finally, the paper still held carefully in both hands. "Your mother sang this to you," she said, and her voice was gentle. "And you haven't been able to sing it since you lost your voice, but you sang it with me." Vincent nodded, then touched his throat and shrugged helplessly, trying to convey the mystery of it. He didn't understand it himself, why that moment had been different, why her humming had unlocked something he'd thought permanently broken. Clara set the paper down on her desk and stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell lavender and ink and something uniquely her. "Will you try again?" she asked. "I want to hear it properly, even if it hurts. Will you try?" He wanted to explain that it wasn't a matter of trying, that his throat simply didn't work that way anymore, that the bullet had done permanent damage according to the doctor, who treated him in Tucson. But Clara was looking at him with such hope, such certainty that something rare had happened between them, that he found himself nodding. She began to hum, the same melody that had stopped him in the street, and Vincent closed his eyes, trying to find that space he'd been in before, that moment of thoughtless response. The tune wrapped around him like a familiar blanket, and he felt his throat begin to work, muscles remembering patterns they'd once known as well as breathing. He opened his mouth and pushed, and at first there was nothing but air and pain, but then, like water finding a crack in stone, sound emerged. It was barely a whisper, more breath than voice, but it was there. The words came haltingly, breaking on every other syllable, but they came. By the sea she waited, by the shore she stood, watching for her sailor love across the wave and flood. The pain was intense, bringing tears to his eyes, but he kept going, driven by Clara's encouraging expression and the desperate need to prove that the first time hadn't been a fluke. She joined him on the second verse, her humming weaving around his fractured singing, supporting the weak places and bridging the gaps. They made it through 2 verses before Vincent's voice gave out completely, leaving him gasping and holding his throat. Clara grabbed a glass of water from her desk and pressed it into his hands, her own hands steadying his when they shook. "Drink slowly," she instructed. "Don't try to talk more. That was amazing, Vincent. That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years." He wanted to laugh at that because his singing had been objectively terrible, all cracks and breaks and missing notes. But the look in her eyes suggested she meant it, that she'd heard something beyond the physical limitations, something to do with meaning and connection, and the simple fact that he'd tried. After he'd drained the glass, Clara took it from him and refilled it from a pitcher on the shelf. "I don't know what happened to your voice," she said, her back to him as she poured. "And you don't have to tell me if you don't want to. But Vincent, if you can sing even a little bit, even just with me, then it's not entirely lost. Maybe it just needs time. Maybe it needs the right person to sing with." She turned back to him, and the look on her face was so open, so vulnerable, that Vincent felt something in his chest crack wider. This wasn't just about a song or a voice. This was about two lonely people who'd found an unexpected harmony, and the terrifying possibility that they might have found something even more. He reached for the pencil on her desk and found a blank corner of a ledger page. His hand moved quickly, urgency overriding his usual hesitation about writing. "Can I see you again?" Clara read the words and smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her whole face. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." She paused, considering. "I have Sunday afternoon free. There's a stretch of beach north of town where hardly anyone goes. It's beautiful, peaceful. Would you like to meet me there? We could talk or not talk, whichever works. We could just be." Vincent nodded so enthusiastically that Clara laughed, and the sound of it was like the song they'd shared, something that reached into his broken places and began, however tentatively, to mend them. Sunday took forever to arrive. Vincent worked through Saturday in a haze of distraction that earned him more than one sharp comment from the dock foreman. He was supposed to be counting crates, but he kept losing track, his mind wandering to Clara and the way she'd looked at him in the lamplight of her office, like he was something worthwhile despite his silence and scars. That evening, he did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He took out his father's old guitar from where it had been stored at the bottom of his trunk, wrapped in oilcloth and regret. The strings were loose and it was badly out of tune, but the wood was still solid, the neck straight. Vincent had been a decent guitarist once, fingers finding chords while his voice carried melodies, and though he was rusty, muscle memory began to return as he worked through basic progressions. The notes were discordant at first, painful to hear, but he persisted, tuning by ear until the sound was at least passable. He couldn't sing, not without Clara apparently, but his fingers could still make music. The realization was both painful and hopeful, a reminder of what he'd lost, but also what remained. Mrs. Pritchard knocked on his door around 9 o'clock, her face appearing in the crack with an expression of shock. "Mr. Northfield, is that you playing?" Vincent nodded, pausing with his hand over the strings, suddenly worried he'd been disturbing the other boarders. But Mrs. Pritchard's expression softened into something almost maternal. "I didn't know you were musical," she said. "It's lovely. Please don't stop on my account. This house could use more music." After she'd gone, Vincent played for another hour, working through songs his mother had taught him, ballads his father had favored, trail songs from his years as a cowboy. His throat ached with the need to sing along, but the guitar would have to be enough for now. Maybe, if Sunday went well, he could play for Clara. Maybe they could make music together in more ways than one. He barely slept that night, and Sunday morning seemed determined to drag itself out as slowly as possible. He attended church services at the small Catholic mission, something he did irregularly more out of habit than faith, and suffered through a sermon about patience and God's timing that felt personally directed. After a quick lunch at the boarding house, he cleaned up as best he could, putting on his better shirt and even shaving, something he usually only bothered with once a week. The beach Clara had described was about 2 miles north of town, beyond the main harbor where the fishing boats clustered. Vincent walked it in good time despite the guitar on his back, following the curve of the coastline until the buildings of San Pedro fell away behind him. The sand here was cleaner, less marked by the industry of the port, and the Pacific stretched endlessly blue toward a horizon that promised other worlds. Clara was already there, sitting on a piece of driftwood worn smooth by waves and time, her shoes off and her skirt tucked up enough to reveal her ankles. It was a scandalously casual pose by the standards of polite society, but there was no one here to be scandalized, just the gulls and the waves and the two of them. She stood when she saw him approaching, a smile spreading across her face that made the walk worthwhile. "You came," she said, and Vincent heard the relief in her voice, the fear that he might have changed his mind. "And you brought a guitar." He swung the instrument down from his shoulder and held it up with a questioning expression. Clara nodded eagerly, settling back onto the driftwood and patting the space beside her in invitation. Vincent sat, very aware of her closeness, of the way their shoulders almost touched, of the warmth of her presence beside him in the cool ocean breeze. He played the song they'd shared first, letting the guitar carry the melody his voice couldn't sustain. His fingers stumbled over a few chord changes, the rust of 3 silent years still evident, but Clara hummed along and the combination was achingly beautiful. When he finished, she applauded softly. "You're full of surprises, Vincent Northfield," she said. "A cowboy who plays guitar and knows Irish songs. Where are you from originally?" He set the guitar aside and reached for the pencil and paper he'd brought specifically for this purpose. "Arizona Territory," he wrote. "Worked cattle drives mostly. Came to California 3 years ago." "After you were hurt," Clara said, and it wasn't quite a question. Vincent nodded, his hand automatically going to the bandana at his throat. She noticed the gesture and hesitated before speaking again. "You don't have to tell me what happened. But if you want to, I promise I won't treat you different after. I already know you're strong, braver than you probably realize." The observation surprised him because Vincent had never felt particularly brave. Surviving hadn't been courage, just stubbornness, a refusal to die in a canyon in Arizona and let the men who shot him have the final word. But Clara was looking at him with such steady certainty that he found himself pulling down the bandana, exposing the scar that he normally kept hidden. It was ugly, a puckered line across the front of his throat that looked exactly like what it was, a bullet wound that should have killed him. Clara looked at it calmly, her expression neither pitying nor horrified, just accepting. She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away and trace the scar with gentle fingers. "This is why you can't talk," she said softly. "Someone shot you." Vincent nodded and took up the pencil again, his handwriting more hurried now as words he'd never told anyone spilled out onto the page. "Outlaws raided our camp. I was night singing, keeping the cattle calm. They shot me first so I couldn't raise alarm. Took me 2 days to crawl to help. Doctor said I was lucky to be alive, but my voice was damaged maybe forever." Clara read it twice, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry that happened to you. I'm so sorry the world can be that cruel." She set the paper down and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "But I'm grateful you survived. I'm grateful you came to San Pedro. I'm grateful that you heard me humming and decided to join in." Vincent squeezed her hand, unable to find words even in writing to express what he was feeling. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, the ocean breathing beside them, until Clara spoke again. "I came to California 2 years ago," she said. "From New York, where I'd gone from Ireland when I was 12. My parents died of fever and my grandmother raised me as best she could, but she passed when I was 20. I had nothing keeping me there, and my uncle had written saying he'd work for me if I wanted it. So I came west, looking for something new, I suppose. A fresh start where I could be more than just the Irish girl in the tenement." She paused, staring out at the water. I thought maybe I'd find freedom here, a chance to be my own person, and in some ways I have. My uncle is good to me, treats me like I have a brain worth using. But it's lonely sometimes, being the woman who keeps books instead of serving drinks, not quite respectable enough for the church ladies, but too respectable for the working girls. I'm caught between worlds, not really belonging in either. Vincent understood that better than she knew. He released her hand long enough to write, "I know lonely. 3 years barely talking. People forget you exist when you can't speak. But I see you," Clara said fiercely. "And you see me. That has to count for something." He nodded and picked up the guitar again, needing to express something too big for his limited writing. He played a melody that was happier than the Irish ballad, something his father had taught him that spoke of new beginnings and open roads. Clara leaned against his shoulder as he played, and the simple contact was enough to make his heart race. They spent the afternoon like that, trading bits of their stories through conversation and writing, Clara talking and Vincent either nodding or scribbling responses. She told him about her work at the saloon, the challenges of keeping accurate books when half the patrons were drunk and the other half trying to cheat the house. He wrote about his life on the docks, the simple satisfaction of physical labor, the way the ocean never seemed to run out of horizon. As the sun began its descent toward the water, Clara stood and extended her hand. "Walk with me." Vincent set the guitar aside and took her hand, letting her pull him up. They walked along the beach, shoes in hand, the waves occasionally rushing up to catch their feet with cold fingers. The world seemed very large and very simple all at once, reduced to sand and sea and the woman beside him. Clara stopped suddenly, turning to face him with an expression that was both nervous and determined. "Vincent, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Am I imagining this connection between us? Because I feel like I've known you forever, like we were supposed to meet, and I don't know if that's real or if I'm just lonely and making too much of a shared song." Vincent dropped his shoes and took both her hands in his, holding them firmly. He shook his head emphatically, then pressed one of her hands to his chest where his heart was beating hard enough that she must have felt it. He couldn't speak, but his eyes and his touch said everything he needed to say. Clara's expression crumbled into relief and joy. "Thank God," she breathed. "I thought I might be going mad." Then, before he could react, she leaned in and kissed him. The kiss was soft and tentative, a question as much as an answer, and Vincent responded with 3 years of stored silence pouring into the touch. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheek, and Clara made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a laugh or both. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, the ocean roaring in Vincent's ears, or maybe that was just his blood. "I've wanted to do that since you sang with me," Clara confessed. "Is that too forward? I don't care if it is. I'm tired of waiting for the proper moment, for the right time. Life's too short and I've already lost too much." Vincent kissed her again in response, longer this time, deeper, tasting salt and hope and the promise of something he'd thought lost forever. When they finally broke apart, the sun was touching the horizon, painting everything gold and orange and impossible. They walked back to town holding hands, and Vincent had never felt so seen, so real, so alive. At the edge of San Pedro, where the buildings began again and propriety demanded they put some respectable distance between them, Clara squeezed his hand one more time. "Same time next Sunday?" she asked. "And maybe we could see each other during the week too. You could come by the saloon, or I could meet you after your work at the docks." Vincent nodded eagerly and fumbled for his pencil. "Every day if you want," he wrote, and Clara laughed with pure delight. "Every day might cause a scandal," she said, "but I find I don't care very much about that. Every day it is." They parted at the Northern Star, Clara slipping inside with a backward glance that promised everything, and Vincent walking back to his boarding house, feeling like he was floating several inches above the ground. Mrs. Pritchard took one look at his face when he came in and smiled knowingly. "You met someone," she said, and it wasn't a question. Vincent nodded, unable to keep the goofy grin off his face even if he'd wanted to. Mrs. Pritchard patted his arm maternally. "Good," she said. "You deserve some happiness, Mr. Northfield. Lord knows you've been quiet enough about whatever sadness you've been carrying. It's good to see you smile." In his room that night, Vincent pulled out more paper and began to write. Not just notes to communicate, but actual writing, trying to capture the day in words because he couldn't sing about it. The sentences were clumsy, and his spelling was atrocious, but he filled 3 pages with descriptions of Clara and the beach, and the way he'd felt when she'd kissed him. It was a poor substitute for a song, but it was something, a record of the day when his silent world had cracked open and let someone else in. The week that followed established a pattern that would define the coming months. Vincent would work the docks during the day, his labor made lighter by the knowledge of what evening would bring. At 6 o'clock, when his shift ended, he'd clean up as best he could at the pump behind the dock house and walk to the Northern Star. The bartender, whose name was Seamus, and who Vincent learned was actually Clara's uncle, had warmed to him considerably after Clara explained the situation. "She's my dead brother's only child," Seamus told Vincent one evening, his accent still thick with Ireland despite 20 years in America. "And she's more like a daughter to me than a niece. You hurt her and I'll have you shanghaied onto the first ship heading for China. We clear?" Vincent nodded seriously and wrote on a scrap of paper Seamus provided, "I would never hurt her, I promise." Seamus studied the note, then studied Vincent's face and finally nodded. "I believe you. Don't make me regret it." Most evenings, Vincent would sit in Clara's office while she finished her bookkeeping, sometimes reading from one of her books, sometimes playing guitar quietly, sometimes just watching her work with an attention that made her blush and laugh and tell him to stop distracting her. When she finished, they'd walk through town together, always chaperoned by propriety if not by an actual person, talking about everything and nothing. Clara did most of the talking, but she'd gotten good at reading Vincent's expressions and gestures, filling in his side of the conversation with intuitive understanding. And slowly, carefully, he began to make small sounds in her presence. Not words exactly, but affirmative noises, small laughs, attempts at her name that came out more like breath than speech but which Clara treated as precious gifts. "Don't push it," she would caution when he grew frustrated with his limitations. "It's enough that you try. More than enough." On Wednesday evening of that first week, Clara told him about a dance being held at the community hall on Saturday night. "I'd like to go," she said carefully, "but I'd only want to go if you'd come with me. I know it might be difficult, all those people, all that noise. But I want to be seen with you, Vincent. I want people to know that I'm courting someone, that you're important to me." The word courting sent a thrill through Vincent that was part excitement and part terror. Courting meant intentions, meant permanence, meant a future that stretched beyond stolen kisses on beaches and evenings in a saloon office. He wanted it desperately and feared it equally, worried that he wasn't enough, couldn't be enough for someone as vibrant as Clara. She must have seen the doubt on his face because she took his hands and held them tightly. "I know what I'm asking," she said. "I know what it means. And I'm sure, Vincent, I'm more sure about this than I've been about anything in my whole life. But if you need more time, if this is moving too fast, tell me. Write it down and I'll understand." Vincent shook his head and reached for his pencil. "Not too fast," he wrote. "Perfect speed. I want to go with you." So Saturday night found them at the community hall, which was packed with what seemed like half of San Pedro. A local band was playing fiddle and guitar, the music energetic if not particularly skilled, and couples were spinning through clumsy waltzes and reels on a floor that shook with their enthusiasm. Vincent felt overwhelmed almost immediately, the noise and press of bodies triggering old anxieties, but Clara's hand in his was an anchor. "We don't have to dance if you don't want to," she said, leaning close to be heard over the music. "We can just stand here and watch." But Vincent shook his head. He'd written out his response earlier, anticipating this exact situation, and he pulled the note from his pocket now. "I may not be able to talk, but I remember how to dance. May I have this honor?" Clara read it, and her face lit up with such joy that Vincent felt 10 feet tall. She led him onto the floor just as the band struck up a waltz, and Vincent placed his hand at her waist, feeling the warmth of her through the fabric of her dress. They'd barely begun to move when he realized two things. First, he hadn't forgotten how to dance at all, the steps coming back as naturally as breathing. And second, Clara fit perfectly in his arms like she'd been designed specifically to be held by him. They danced 3 dances in a row, until both were breathless and laughing, and when they finally took a break, several people approached to be introduced. Clara handled it beautifully, explaining that Vincent had been injured and couldn't speak, but was a wonderful person regardless, deflecting the curious questions with humor and grace. Vincent found himself the subject of interested looks from several young women and jealous glares from a few young men, all of which he ignored in favor of watching Clara. "You're staring again," she told him during a slower dance later in the evening, her head resting against his shoulder. Vincent made an affirmative noise and held her closer, not apologizing because he wasn't sorry. Let the whole town know how he felt. Let them all see that the quiet cowboy from the docks had found something worth shouting about, even if he could only express it in silence. As summer turned toward fall, Vincent and Clara became a fixture in San Pedro, the unusual couple that somehow worked. Seamus gave his formal blessing to the courtship, though he grumbled that he'd have preferred a man who could properly ask for his niece's hand. Clara told him that Vincent had asked perfectly well in writing, and that it counted just as much. Vincent began taking more pride in his appearance, using his saved wages to buy better clothes, to get regular haircuts, to look like the kind of man Clara deserved. The other dockworkers teased him good-naturedly about being in love, and he took the ribbing with good humor because it was true and he wasn't ashamed of it. In October, nearly 4 months after that first shared song, Vincent planned something special. He'd been saving money carefully, and he used it to buy a simple gold ring from the jeweler in town, nothing fancy but solid and real. He arranged with Seamus to borrow the saloon's back room after hours, and spent the afternoon decorating it with wildflowers Clara had mentioned loving and candles he'd bought from the chandler. When Clara arrived that evening, expecting their usual routine, she found instead a room transformed. Vincent was waiting in his best clothes, the guitar in his hands, his heart in his throat. Clara stopped in the doorway, her hand going to her mouth. "Vincent, what is this?" He gestured for her to sit, and when she did, he began to play. The song was the one they'd first shared, but he'd spent weeks working on an arrangement that let the guitar carry both melody and harmony. And then, knowing it would hurt but not caring, knowing it would be broken but needing to try, Vincent opened his mouth and sang. His voice was terrible, cracking on every third word, barely more than a whisper on the high notes, but the words were clear enough. He sang about the girl waiting by the sea, but he changed the ending, writing new verses about how the sailor returned, how they were reunited, how love didn't always end in tragedy. He sang about second chances and unexpected connections, and the way one person could change everything. Tears were streaming down Clara's face by the time he finished, and his throat felt like he'd swallowed broken glass, but it was worth it. He set the guitar aside and pulled out the ring box, his hands shaking as he opened it. He'd written his proposal earlier, a whole page of reasons why she should marry him despite his limitations, but Clara didn't give him time to retrieve it. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Whatever you're asking, the answer is yes. Always yes." Vincent slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, which seemed like a sign from a universe that didn't always offer them. Clara threw her arms around his neck and kissed him hard enough to make his healing throat protest, but he didn't care. She'd said yes. She was going to marry him, and he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve it. They were married in December, at the little Catholic mission with Father Rodriguez presiding, and what seemed like half the town in attendance. Vincent wore a suit he'd bought specially for the occasion, and Clara wore a dress of cream-colored silk that made her look like something out of a dream. Seamus walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and Vincent had to blink hard to keep his own vision clear. The ceremony was brief, adapted for Vincent's inability to speak traditional vows. Instead, he'd written them out beforehand, and Father Rodriguez read them aloud while Vincent held Clara's hands and nodded his confirmation. "I, Vincent Northfield, take you, Clara Daniels, to be my wife. I promise to love you in silence and in song, in sickness and in health, for all the days of my life. You gave me back my voice, and I give you my heart, completely and forever." Clara spoke her own vows with a steady voice that only broke on the last few words, and when Father Rodriguez pronounced them married, the kiss they shared was witnessed by everyone Vincent had come to know in San Pedro, and everyone Clara had built a life with. The reception at the Northern Star was loud and joyous, and if Vincent couldn't join in the toasts and speeches, his happiness was evident in every gesture, every smile, every time he looked at his wife. His wife. The words echoed in his head with wonder. They'd rented a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but theirs, with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a view of the ocean from the front porch. Seamus had gifted them some furniture, Mrs. Pritchard had contributed quilts and kitchen supplies, and the dockworkers had taken up a collection to buy them a decent bed. It was a modest start, but as Vincent carried Clara over the threshold that night, it felt like a palace. Their first night as husband and wife was tender and fumbling and perfect in its imperfection. Vincent couldn't whisper sweet nothings, but his hands and his kisses spoke clearly enough, and Clara's responses left no doubt about her feelings. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Clara traced the scar on his throat gently. "I'm grateful for this," she said softly. "Not that you were hurt, never that. But if it hadn't happened, you might never have come to San Pedro. We might never have met. And I can't imagine my life without you in it now." Vincent kissed her forehead and held her close, understanding exactly what she meant. The bullet that had taken his voice had also set him on a path that led here, to this woman, to this life. It was a strange thing to be grateful for trauma, but he couldn't deny the truth of it. Life settled into new rhythms after the wedding. Vincent continued to work the docks while Clara kept the books at the Northern Star, and their evenings were spent in their little house, cooking together, reading, making music. Vincent's guitar was a constant presence, and he'd begun writing songs even if he couldn't fully sing them, Clara providing the lyrics while he worked out melodies. Slowly, painfully, his voice continued to improve. It would never be what it was, the doctors had made that clear, but with Clara's patient encouragement, he began to reclaim pieces of it. He could speak occasionally now, short sentences that came out rough but intelligible, and though it still hurt, the pain was manageable. Clara celebrated every word like a victory, never pushing but always encouraging. In the spring of 1879, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The news sent Vincent into a panic of joy and terror in equal measures. He would be a father, responsible for a tiny life, and how could he teach a child anything when he could barely speak? But Clara laughed at his fears and took his face in her hands. "You'll teach them with your actions," she said firmly, "with your kindness and your strength and your music. You'll teach them that silence doesn't mean you have nothing to say, and that love speaks louder than words ever could." The pregnancy was difficult at times, and Vincent hovered anxiously, driving Clara to distraction with his overprotectiveness. Seamus teased him mercilessly about it, but Vincent noticed the older man was equally attentive, making sure Clara never lifted anything heavy, never worked too long. On a warm October evening, almost exactly a year after Vincent's proposal, Clara went into labor. Vincent sent for the midwife and then proceeded to pace the floor uselessly, his inability to offer verbal encouragement making him feel more helpless than ever. But when the midwife finally emerged 12 hours later and told him he had a son, Vincent's legs nearly gave out from relief. Clara was exhausted but radiant when he entered the bedroom, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. "Come meet your son," she said, and Vincent approached like he was walking on holy ground. The baby was impossibly small, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were still the indeterminate blue of newborns. He was perfect and terrifying, and Vincent had no idea how something so tiny could make him feel so much. Clara placed the baby in his arms, and Vincent held his son with the careful reverence of someone handling the most precious thing in existence. "What should we name him?" Clara asked. "I thought maybe Thomas, after my father, or we could name him after your father if you'd prefer." Vincent looked down at his son and thought about names and legacies, and the life this child would have. He wished desperately that he could speak clearly, that his first words to his son could be more than the halting whispers he managed. But then the baby yawned hugely, a gesture so innocently human that Vincent felt his heart crack open even wider. He managed to rasp out 2 words, forcing them through a throat that protested the effort. "Thomas Vincent." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Vincent Northfield," she repeated. "It's perfect. He's perfect." Over the next months, Vincent discovered that fatherhood was both harder and more rewarding than he'd imagined. Thomas was a good baby mostly, sleeping for reasonable stretches and eating well, but there were nights when he cried inconsolably, and Vincent felt useless, unable to soothe his son with lullabies the way Clara could. But he learned other ways to help, walking the floor with Thomas while humming as best he could, the vibration of it seeming to calm the baby even when the melody was broken. His voice continued to strengthen, aided perhaps by the constant need to communicate with his child. By Thomas's first birthday, Vincent could speak in full sentences most of the time, though his voice remained rough and he still struggled with volume. It was enough, though, more than he'd ever hoped for in those dark days after the shooting. Clara fell pregnant again in 1880, and this time Vincent was less panicked, more confident. Their daughter arrived in March of 1881, tiny and fierce, and howling her displeasure at the world from her first breath. They named her Margaret Rose, after Clara's grandmother, and she had her mother's hazel eyes and what would become her father's stubborn determination. With 2 children and limited space, they needed a bigger house. Vincent had been saving money carefully, and with a loan from Seamus, they were able to buy a piece of land a bit further from town, with room for a garden and animals. Vincent spent his spare time building, aided by fellow dock workers who contributed labor in exchange for Clara's cooking and Seamus's beer. By the summer of 1881, they had a proper house, 3 bedrooms and a real kitchen, with a porch that faced the ocean and enough land for Thomas to run wild on when he got older. Life became a rich tapestry of work and family, of small joys and occasional struggles. Vincent eventually left the docks to work as a carpenter, a trade he'd learned building their house and discovered he enjoyed. The work paid better and was less physically demanding, allowing him to be home more with Clara and the children. His reputation for quality work spread, and soon he had more commissions than he could easily handle. Thomas grew into a talkative child, constantly chattering and asking questions, making up for his father's years of silence perhaps. Vincent would listen patiently, offering responses when he could and gestures when his voice failed. Margaret was quieter, more observant, but when she sang, even as a small child, her voice was clear and pure in a way that brought tears to Vincent's eyes. The gift he'd lost had somehow been passed to his daughter, and watching her discover it was both painful and healing. Clara continued to keep books for the Northern Star until Thomas was 5 and Margaret 3, at which point she decided to stay home full-time. The saloon had been sold to new owners after Seamus decided to retire, and while they'd offered to keep Clara on, she'd chosen her children instead. Seamus moved into a small house near theirs, becoming a fixture in the children's lives, a grandfather in all but name. The years passed with the steady rhythm of waves on shore, each day building on the last into something solid and enduring. There were hard times, a winter when Vincent broke his arm and couldn't work for 2 months, a summer when Margaret got scarlet fever and they thought they might lose her, stretches when money was tight and worry kept them up late. But they weathered each crisis together, Vincent and Clara, their love proving to be the foundation everything else was built on. In 1885, when Thomas was 6 and Margaret 4, Clara surprised Vincent with a 3rd pregnancy. They hadn't been planning another child, had thought their family complete, but the news brought joy rather than concern. Their 2nd son arrived in January of 1886, in the middle of a rare California cold snap that frosted the windows and made everyone huddle close to the fireplace. They named him Sean Patrick, honoring both Clara's Irish heritage and Vincent's mother's maiden name, and he came into the world laughing instead of crying, setting the tone for a personality that would prove sunny and unflappable. Vincent was 36 years old now, his dark hair showing the first threads of silver, his body bearing the marks of hard work and life. His voice had settled into what it would be, rough and low but functional, enough to tell his children stories and sing them simplified lullabies. The guitar was still a constant companion, and his children would often fall asleep to the sound of him playing on the porch, melodies drifting through open windows like blessings. On a Sunday afternoon in June of 1886, Vincent and Clara returned to the beach where they'd had their first real conversation, the place where everything had truly begun. Thomas and Margaret ran ahead, chasing waves and looking for shells, while Sean dozed in a sling against Clara's chest. They sat on the same piece of driftwood, older now and more weathered just like them. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Clara asked, watching their children play. "If I hadn't been humming that day, if you hadn't joined in, if we'd both just kept walking." Vincent considered the question seriously, then shook his head. "No," he said, the words still requiring effort but coming more easily than it once had. "We were meant to find each other. Somehow, someway, it would have happened." Clara leaned against his shoulder, fitting into the space that seemed made for her. You're probably right. I think I would have searched until I found you, even without knowing what I was looking for. Sing it, Vincent requested, his voice barely above a whisper. The song, our song. Clara began to hum the familiar melody, the Irish tune that had brought them together 8 years ago, and Vincent joined her. His voice cracked on some notes and faded on others, but it was there, real and present, weaving with Clara's humming to create something imperfectly beautiful. Margaret, hearing them from down the beach, ran back and added her clear, pure voice to the mix, singing words she'd learned from her mother. Thomas joined with his boyish treble, and even baby Sean seemed to coo along. They made strange music there on the beach, the Northfield family, all different voices combining into a harmony that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Sailors passing on distant ships might have heard it, a fragment of melody carried on the wind, and wondered at its source. But for Vincent, the music was simply the sound of his life, unexpected and hard-won and more precious than anything he could have imagined in those dark days after the bullet. He'd been silent for 3 years, convinced his voice was gone forever. But Clara had shown him that silence wasn't the same as having nothing to say, and that sometimes the most important songs were the ones you sang together, blending voices and lives into something neither could create alone. The sun began its descent toward the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange and deep crimson, and the Northfield family packed up their things to head home. Vincent carried Margaret on his shoulders while Thomas held Clara's hand, little Sean still sleeping peacefully against his mother's chest. They walked slowly, in no hurry, because home would be there waiting and they had all the time in the world. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet except for the usual creaks and sighs of settling wood, Vincent pulled Clara onto the porch. The ocean was a constant whisper in the distance, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He'd brought his guitar, and he played while Clara hummed, the same song that had started everything but with 8 years of life and love woven into every note. When the last chord faded into the evening air, Clara kissed him softly. "I love you, Vincent Northfield," she said. "My quiet cowboy who found his voice again." "I love you, Clara," he replied, the words still rough but clear and infinitely true. "You gave me back more than my voice. You gave me everything." They sat together as darkness fell completely, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the ocean breathe and the children dream. Inside, their house stood solid and warm, filled with the evidence of their life together. Thomas's drawings on the wall, Margaret's doll on the chair, Sean's cradle in the corner. Outside, the Pacific stretched endlessly toward tomorrow, promising more days and more songs and more love than one man had any right to hope for. But Vincent had learned that hope wasn't about rights or deserving. It was about having the courage to sing when your voice was broken, to love when your heart was scared, to trust that sometimes the most important melodies were the ones you never planned to sing but couldn't help joining in on when the moment was right. He'd been silent for 3 years. He'd be grateful and singing, however imperfectly, for the rest of his life.